It's really nice to have you all here virtually, and it's a very special seminar as far as we're concerned at the Crown Center, as it involves two of our non-resident fellows, Dr. Jillian Schwedler and Dr. Daniel Neep, and it is, of course, also on occasion of the publication of Dr. Schwedler's new book, Protesting Jordan, which you're going to hear a lot about. But before I introduce these wonderful scholars, just a series of notes, which is that the current seminar, like all of our seminars, is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel in case you missed it or you wanted to revisit it. So please go there and subscribe. Also, because we cannot get enough of Dr. Schwedler and Dr. Neep, they have recorded a wonderful episode of the Crown Center podcast, Counter Argument, on the question of Jordan that we will be sharing with you later on in the year. And so keep your eye on that, and you can subscribe to our podcast so you can get notifications straight when these episodes are dropped. Another thing is, don't forget, as always, that if you have a question, please feel to put them in the Q&A section and not in the chat section. We're not monitoring those for your questions. And so with that said, let me introduce Dr. Schwedler and Dr. Neep. Our guest of honor and our speaker today, as I mentioned, is Dr. Jillian Schwedler, who is a professor of political science at the City University of New York's Hunter College, and also at the Graduate Center there. She is, of course, for us, a non-residential fellow at the Crown Center. And she's just wonderful to have not be in residence, but today have be in residence. She is a member of the Governing Council of the American Political Science Association and a former member of the Board of Directors of the Middle East Studies Association of North America. She has, as you all know, many books and many articles. Her articles have been published in a wide variety of journals, and her books include the award-winning Faith in Moderation, Islamist Parties in Jordan and Yemen. And along with the wonderful Lola Khalili, she has published Policing and Prisons in the Middle East. As I mentioned, her latest book, which was just published in 2022, is called Protesting Jordan, Geographies of Power and Dissent. And we're very excited to hear her talk about that book and be in conversation with our moderator today, which is Dr. Daniel Neep. Dr. Daniel Neep is currently a Mellon Research Fellow at Georgetown University's Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service, and he is also a non-resident fellow at the Crown Center. Because we can't get enough of him and we're constantly trying to keep him, he was also previously the Assistant Director for Research, and before that, he was a sabbatical fellow at the Crown Center. He is the author of Occupying Syria, Insurgency, Space, and State Formation, and is currently finishing a second book that I can't wait to read. I've read parts of it. It's called The Nation Belongs to All, The Making of Modern Syria, which explains Syria's political development in terms of global transformations, changing economic infrastructures, emerging political geographies, and waves of political protests. So very nice synergy between our two guests. With that, I invite Professor Schwedler to come and speak for about 7 to 10 minutes, and afterwards, Dr. Neep will be in conversation with her, and then we will have about 30 minutes, as always, for a Q&A. Thank you so much and welcome.
Thank you so much for inviting me here. I'm pleased to be at the Crown Center and to have a chance to talk about my new book. I'm not going to be able to give a full book talk today because we're going to have a conversation instead, but I did want to give you a little bit of a flavor of some of the things that are in the book. It's a look at protests in Jordan from the 19th century to the present, and Jordan's a fascinating case because it has so many protests, hundreds and sometimes thousands of protests a year, and yet it doesn't have the kinds of massacres you see in many cases. The book makes 3 big theoretical interventions, which we'll talk a bit about today: protests and their role in state-making processes and state maintaining, rather than just these periodic disruptions. They're really central to state making. protests shape and are shaped by the built environment, and I'll show you a few examples of that today. And then the way protests are connected to regional and global entanglements, financial connections, securitization, and vice versa. I'm going to give 3 quick illustrations to show just some of the arguments I make in the book. One has to do with the way that protests helped shape the political and economic geography of Jordan today. So in the before the colonial state-making period, really it was the Jordanian, Transjordanian area was really just focused on these towns that were part of a north-south transit route. And so after World War I, when Amir Abdullah with the British come in to build a state, they decide first that they're going to build the capital in Salt, but the Saltis, when they showed up there, started protesting and didn't want them to settle there for the capital. So they chose instead Amman. So right off the bat, the sort of geography that we see where Amman is the central part of the state today is a result of protests and resistance and not wanting him to settle elsewhere. So the capital becomes a place for protest quite rapidly. This is at the Grand Husseini Mosque downtown. And that repertoire of protesting in front of the Grand Husseini Mosque continues up until today. You see widespread protests. They gather at the mosque, nothing to do with Islam. It's simply a convenient place to gather, and will march to the municipal center and so on. But protests downtown used to be really, really disruptive. But as the capital has expanded, the main government buildings aren't downtown, the commercial center is not downtown anymore. The protests there simply aren't as disruptive. Instead, you have these sort of sprawling capital in all directions. And particularly in West Amman, you see the sort of financial investment, the high-rise, shiny buildings, et cetera. And these have themselves become a site of resistance. So people are angry about this. Jordanians that have their they don't have enough water and their roofs are falling in, are really frustrated and angry at these investments in the capital. Here's just a quick billboard of that project where you see this sort of the woman with the velvet rope and the glamorous, this website used to say, glitter your world. And so people are angry because they feel that they're being left out of this new vision. And in fact, they march often to the capital. This is an unemployed march, protesters, a march of unemployed that decide to march on the Capitol because they're so angry and they're not getting their grievances met. And after several weeks of protests, they were actually given jobs. And that became a new repertoire of protests that the unemployed would march on the Capitol to demand jobs. And so you see this whole geography that emerges. People in these towns that used to be center of this north-south corridor are feeling frustrated and will march to the Capitol to make demands. And one of the ways in which their anger and demands has also shaped, another way that it's also shaped the political geography is that the electoral system, in response to their resistance and anger and protest, disproportionately represents people outside the Capitol in the electoral system. So it's gerrymandered in a way that the capital has less representation than these outlying areas. Again, I show directly as a result of resistance. The second one, again, I'm going quickly here, but I just wanted to not take too long, is about space and the built environment. And so here I had developed a typology that shows the ways in which protests shape the built environment and vice versa. So just to give a few quick examples, erasures are government efforts to eliminate any signs of a protest. Bahrain's, of course, a great example. Pearl Roundabout was disassembled after the protest, and the roundabout was changed into a perpendicular intersection. And even more, this coin I have on the upper right here, which had the Pearl Roundabout statue on it, the coin was taken out of circulation, right? So it's an effort to erase any evidence that there had been a protest there. Protest art, this is, of course, from Egypt, all has to be whitewashed and eliminated. Any signs that there were protests there are erased. And usually in their place, put up some kind of nationalist symbol, statue to the military or the police, or quite often a really, really big flag, right, get put in these places to sort of re-signify them. So you see these sort of struggles over signification in locations where there are a lot of protests. Another way the built environment is shaped by protest is through exposures. Here on the right, you see Paris, of course, famously in the 1860s reconstructed for many reasons, but these David Harvey shows how these boulevards outside of the city end at army barracks. So there become ways, these wide roads become ways to move troops in and out when there's unrest very quickly. On the left, of course, is Tahrir, which was built in emulation of Paris. And so the irony here is that Tahrir Square is one of the most policeable spaces in Cairo because of these wide thoroughfares that could move troops in, but it also created a massive place, a place for massive gatherings. So you see, it can go both ways. So this is a kind of exposure. In Jordan, this is Sumaya Street. This is the opening scene to Hurt Locker. This is in the Wihdat or New Camp, one of the 48 refugee camps, Palestinian refugee camps. And it was, this street used to be a narrow street. And after Black September, the street was widened precisely again because the government discovered in the Black September, in the years leading up to Black September and the fighting with the Palestinian Fedayeen, that they couldn't easily infiltrate the camps because they were so narrow. So this street is a direct result, a kind of exposure. This is from Ferguson, Missouri. After the Michael Brown protests, the municipality went down and cut down a large number of trees in and around the homes, around the park where people were protesting, and proceeded to drive police cars at night and flash security or flash beams, spotlights into people's homes. So it's kind of exposure and a changing of the built environment directly as a result of protest. Containment is just an example of what you can protest in the university, but you can't leave. You can protest in the camps, but you can't leave. And so the surveillance and walls are built in particular ways to facilitate that. And here last is an exclusion. This is that Abdali project I showed you a minute ago with the high gleaming skyscrapers in Jordan. On the far right of this, in this 3D model, was a huge plaza above the Abdali Mall in Amman. And that plaza was never built. And one of the reasons it wasn't built, the architect and urban planner, Eliana Abu Hamdi, was interviewing them and asked specifically why it wasn't there. And they told her that they decided not to build it because they were worried people would use it as a place for protesting. And they didn't want protesting anywhere near this plaza. So the project was changed for that reason. And closures are closing off spaces. These are traffic circles that used to have protests be very common there. And now they're fenced off and landscaped. And again, removing places where people used to protest. Here's another gathering place where people used to protest since 2018. And this is from these major protests, the anti-tax and anti-austerity protests. And this then became a new place where people would gather for quite a long time until during the pandemic, this concrete wall was put up around it, right? And this has no purpose. You can enter and exit the parking lot completely fine. But if there's protests in the lot, nobody can see them, right? And so it's a way of sort of ruining the space for protests. And this has happened across Amman, this sort of enclosing places. So I have many more examples in this, but really the whole built environment can be changed in a result of the sort of trying to prevent places of protest. Just my last example really quick has to do with the political effects of routine protests. One of the things the book tries to do is to show, we shouldn't just be paying attention to these big bursts of protests. We need to pay attention to the fact that there's hundreds and sometimes thousands of protests routinely. And in Jordan, it's a common form of political expression is to take to the streets. And so, but how do we think about these routine protests? A lot of them seem almost scripted. You show up at a certain place and the police stand here and you go here and you march and then you go home after a few hours. And everything is very familiar. And so the book asks, what's going on? What's the point of these protests that seem almost boring? What are protesters doing, et cetera? So here's a protest at the Kaluti Mosque. These were all taken on the same day. And these are protests that are very routine. They used to be the site of massive protests in 2000 and during the Second Intifada, where people wanted to march on the Israeli embassy, which is in proximity to this particular location. And thousands would show up and the police had to block all these streets. But over the next months, the protests continued, but they diminished in numbers. And so this routine of we'll gather here to march on the Israeli embassy turned into just, we're going to pretend to march on the Israeli embassy. We're not actually going to try to get to the Israeli embassy. So here you can see police vehicles showing up as a protest has started. And the riot police are over here waiting for the protest. The protesters are gathered here, assembling. Here you see a mix of Muslim Brotherhood and the Wahda party, the leftist communist party, protesting together. And one of the things that's interesting about this is that after a short period, the Muslim Brotherhood pack up their flags and leave. And so one of the things I've discovered is the Muslim Brotherhood frequently uses protests as kind of a performance. I mean, they are real protests, but they'll show up, they'll take pictures and they'll go home and then they'll publish them in Estabil and other outlets online. And they show how contentious they are and they're all challenging the government, but they're really not. It's really more of a photo op for its own constituencies to show that it goes to all these things. But in reality, it's never there when you're confronting the police. It's always trying to maintain sort of within the lines of what the regime wants. Indeed, when they have big protests downtown, I show in the book, the Muslim Brotherhood has their own parade guards with yellow vests and the Muslim Brotherhood logo on it, because they want everybody to completely stay in line. Here, there's finally the police, you can see at a distance, are gathering to block the march, this pretend march on the Israeli embassy. But you'll notice the sidewalks are completely open because we don't want to we don't want to inconvenience pedestrians or others who live in the area. So it really is a performance of a protest, and the protesters will go in the street and pretend to march on the embassy. I'm about 15 feet from the police here. Right. So this is interesting about Jordan. Typically in non-democratic settings, you don't really go right up to police and riot police with shields and take pictures of them. But the atmosphere is really calm. Nobody really thinks anything's going to go wrong, but they're still prepared. It's still a show of force. Here I am just walking behind the riot police, taking pictures. You can see the protest over here. Here I am in the middle of the protest up front with the women, which is a common tactic, not just in Jordan, but when there's a lot of photographers present, to put protesters up front. So if there's any violence, it can be captured, and violence against women looks particularly bad. On this particular day, though, you had this new technique, which was what are now called baltijia. In the time in Jordan, this was 2009, they didn't use that term yet. It's become widespread across the region. But you had these plainclothes people who are clearly in coordination with the police. And in this instance, they lined up and held hands in front of the riot police between the protesters. So again, if any violence ensues, plausibly the regime could say it wasn't them. So what's the point of these protests then? And I know I'm moving quickly. One, as I said, for the Muslim Brotherhood in particular, it signals commitments to their followers. They can take pictures of themselves at protests and post them. And people reading that have no idea that they're not contentious at all. Activists say that they use these protests to keep spaces open, right? They're afraid if they stop protesting, they're not going to get a chance to go back again, that the government's going to shut down that space, which indeed happens quite frequently. They want to keep the topic in public discourse. They don't really think they're going to succeed at getting Jordan to cancel the peace treaty, but they can succeed in showing that there's dissent to it, that people oppose the peace treaty with Israel. And so they'll show up to continue that dialogue. Also placemaking. People know where to go when there's protests, because even if there's small protests, people know what the go-to places for protests are. And in Jordan, the downtown area is the most, century-long go-to place for protests, but also places like the Fourth Circle, where the parliament or the prime ministry is located, or in front of parliament. So I'll just end with this, a new enclosure. This is where the Kaludi, the last set of routine protests were taking place. This now has a fence around it. Again, a way of closing off this space for protesters. And this is for rent. So if you want to rent a rocky field in Jordan, this field is for rent. So I'll stop there because I know Dan and I are going to have a conversation and cover more ground, but I want to give you a sense. It's a very visual kind of book. There's a lot of photographs in it, but I wanted to give you a sense of the kinds of things I'm doing it. So I will stop there, and Dan.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Jillian. And thank you to the Crown Centre for giving me not just one, but two opportunities to discuss Jillian's book with her. As Nagmi mentioned, we've recorded an episode of the Crown Centre's Counter Argument podcast, which will be forthcoming in coming weeks. And in that podcast, Jillian and I talk about Jordanian identity. We talk about nationalism. We talk about the East Bank and Palestinian divide. So I'm going to take a different direction with my comments today. If you want to learn about those topics, join the listen into the Crown Centre podcast and keep an eye open for that. So in preparation for today, I reread Jillian's book, and I am very happy to report that it does stand up to a second in-depth reading. And let's be honest, not all academic texts do that. So I want to highlight what it is that is just so rich and so engaging about Jillian's book and Jillian's arguments. That sets it, I think, in a category of its own when we look at recent work in the field of Middle East political science and when we look at Middle East studies more generally. This book is not just a narrow, limited contribution to a niche debate in political science. It is characterized, I think, not just by its ambition, but also by its scope. Protesting Jordan takes us from the Adwan revolt against the Ottomans in 1867 to the unoccupied towers of the Abdali Boulevard mega project in 2020. We go from bread riots and anti-austerity protests in the 1980s and the 1990s to the first environmental protests in 2009. Ethnographic insights about the micro practices of protest at the Kaluti Mosque follow on from this wonderful historical survey of master plans for urban planning in Amman over the course of 4 decades. The richness of this evidence in Jillian's book is never overwhelmed by the theoretical framing, abstract analytical reasoning, or weighing very heavily its contribution to esoteric debates in political science. We learn something about Jordan from this book, which I think is important. So I lived in Jordan for 18 months after I left Syria in 2012. And I remember feeling disconcerted that the country that I was coming to know was never quite the same as that represented in the literature. You know, what I was learning about tribes on the ground didn't quite chime with what I read about tribes in the literature in Jordan. What I was learning about the divisions and tensions and complexities of the identities of being Hispanic or Jordanian Palestinian didn't chime with what I was seeing on the ground. I wish I had had this book to read when I first went to Jordan, when I first lived there in 2012. And I think this unusually deep, this type of book is not the type of book you can write when you dive into a country using it as a case study, a quick and dirty case study. It really does speak. It's a testament to the fact that Jillian has spent 25 years engaging with Jordan in different ways, in different capacities. So it really does speak to the merits, I think, of having a long-term commitment to the country that we're studying. So I think it's important to highlight that, first of all. I have 3 kind of areas that I want to bring up in conversation with Jillian. The first is about, and it follows really nicely on from Jillian's conclusion, I think, it's about the politics of small things. And Jillian's arguments that it's worth looking at protests in Jordan, even though they haven't brought about regime change, even though they haven't brought about a major political change. And how I read Jillian's argument is it's about bringing to political science this kind of ethnographic sensibility to reveal what Denise Constant-Martin has called unidentified political objects. I love this phrase. Those sites and actions that are unseen by mainstream political science, but which are nevertheless meaningful for political actors locally. And Jillian talks about how there are hundreds, as you mentioned, there are hundreds and if not thousands of protests that have taken place in Jordan over the years that simply pass under the radar. We don't pay them very much attention. They're going on and we're looking elsewhere. But this is where politics is happening for people on the ground. The problem I want to suggest with this, the problem is that people often find meaningful their involvement in activities that are ultimately inconsequential in the scheme of things. And an objection might be, okay, so Jordanians protest a lot, but that maybe reminds us that Jordanians have agency, have political agency. We shouldn't have forgotten that in the first place, but okay. And we also learned that, you know, the coercive response of the state varies. It's not always the same. It's not monolithic, but it varies according to neighborhood. And it varies not just according to neighborhood, but also to how protesters are using space at particular points in different places. Are they having sit-ins? Are they doing fleeting marches? Are they trying to put up a tent? This is the worst thing you could do in the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, is to have a protest and try and erect a tent. But apart from that, I want to ask you, Jillian, for those who haven't read the book, could you outline how your argument deals with this kind of objection? You know, what is it about these protests ultimately that is so important, given that it's difficult to pin down their consequences? And interestingly, in your presentation, I really like the way you phrased it by looking at the kind of impact it had for the movements and why did the Muslim Brotherhood participate in this type of politics. But even then, with that kind of framing, it shifts our attention away from the protests as protests back towards the movement, towards the social movement and its intentions. So, but I think your argument's doing something else in the book. It's pushing us to look at protests without collapsing them into the fortunes of social movements and contentious politics, which has been a big debate in that study of the region for years in political science. Thinking about them as an epiphenomenon and focusing on this epiphenomenal activity of protest. That was a very long question. So yeah, I think that's the first topic I wanted to raise with you, Jillian. Could you just outline how you kind of handle that line of argumentation?
Yeah, so one of the central arguments is that we need to think beyond the sort of success-failure model of protest. Do they accomplish what they set out to do or not? Do they get the peace treaty canceled or not? It's not that I'm uninterested in that question, and I deal with that question throughout the book. So just in addition to the kind of protests I talked about here, you actually see a lot of these small protests accomplish things. They actually, when they're demanding things like, we need a cell phone tower in our neighborhood, we need running water, we don't have enough, they'll block roads, they'll sit in front of government offices and actually very often get something they want. I showed the workers that would march to the Capitol, they got permanent jobs in industries. Interestingly, they asked for jobs in industries that had been privatized. So they were asking of the government, of the regime, to get them jobs in the private sector, and they succeeded, right? So one of the reasons people protest is because it's the way to get to the ear of the government. People don't take the parliament seriously as a place for political debate. It's seen as a network for patronage and distribution of, for patronage, basically, to sort of placate people, et cetera. And have, the challenging opposition political parties have largely been shut out of that assembly. So protests become a place for important political expression. So on one hand, they do get results, but beyond the sort of, did this group get what it wanted? I'm really fascinated by looking at places like the changing impact of protests in the downtown area over a century. So you see the same repertoire, the spatial and temporal repertoire. You meet at the Grand Husseini Mosque, again, like the Kaluti Mosque. It's nothing to do with Islam. It's just a gathering point. It's a focal point. So people know you meet at the Grand Husseini Mosque, and then you march to the municipal center. It takes a few hours, you have speeches, and then you go home. So what's interesting to me is if you just look at protests, not who's doing protests, but just protests in that site, one of the things you see over this long period is those protests go from being very, very disruptive because they can shut down the government and the commerce center in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and even the 50s, to not being contentious at all. Now it's the government's favorite place for people to protest because you can have thousands of people down there and it's not disruptive of any place else. Government offices aren't down there except the municipal center, no major commercial centers down there. So the work that gets done by those protests isn't to be disruptive anymore. It's simply to be, to gather and have that spectacle. And again, for the Muslim Brotherhood, they'll take photographs. Shops don't even close down when there's thousands of people there. Nobody's concerned there's going to be damage or being boarded up. So I would look at a number of places, largely in Amman, but not only in Amman, where protests change in their impact over time, and new repertoires emerge and change, and new spaces emerge. And you see these sort of patterns, different patterns than when you're looking just at the social movements. And one of the things that with the downtown protest that I think the studies of protests get wrong, particularly the quantitative studies of protests, is you would see those downtown protests as spikes, like thousands of people showed up, and you would think these are moments of contention. And in fact, the downtown protests aren't the moments of contention. It's 50 guys over here that they're bringing out billy cups and beating up people in the protest to disperse them. And I think that gets lost when you don't focus on when you focus on either social movements per se or just those quantitative measures. Not that I'm against those approaches, but I'm trying to show other things that we can see by attending to things like small protests. And related, just a final thing on small protests is, if you are interested in those big protests, like the uprising period, and I show in my chapter that Jordan did have a massive uprising. It didn't turn revolutionary, but it did have a massive uprising that the government was very, very panicked over. If you're not paying attention to the small protests all the time, you don't know what's really an innovation when there's a large protest. So I could see, because I was familiar with certain things, the thousands of people gathering downtown was like, okay, that's kind of ho-hum. But these groups in these outlying places, they hadn't mobilized before. And that's really where you see those innovations. So I think the small protests enrich our understanding of those big moments, if that's our object of analysis.
Yeah, it's the importance of the context in which they're taking place, which isn't necessarily visible from the outside. And I think by combining the spatial with the temporal, as you do, looking at the historical development of where processes are taking place, you're able to draw out something that other works don't, which is how these protests change the built environment, change the spatial environment in which they're taking place. Because the more that protests take place in a certain location, the state starts to make plans to close off those spaces or restructure them. So by looking at how these protests unfold over time, you're able to get this kind of dialogue, if you like. You're able to highlight this dialogue that's taking place between the actions of the protesters and the city, the urban spaces in which those protests are taking place. The urban spaces are not static or empty. They're actually being transformed by protest in a way that's, I think, often overlooked by a lot of political science that doesn't pay too much attention to, if it pays attention to where things are, it doesn't necessarily acknowledge the way in which the meaning of spaces changes over time. I think that's,
most of the work that looks at space and protest look at space during the protest, like in the instance of the process, not before and after, not the sort of long-term effects of protest in the space. And I'm glad you emphasized in the beginning it's a book that's deeply about Jordan, but it's not only about Jordan. And so on the point you just made, I live in downtown Brooklyn, and during the pandemic with the George Floyd protests, people started gathering at the Barclays Center, and that nobody protested there before, but it became this space, the plaza, people would gather and they would march in various directions. Up until now, there's always barricades sort of stacked along the side of the Barclays Center in anticipation that they're going to need to barricade it off. So that's kind of a permanent place that the state anticipates might be a space for protest. And so I'm really trying to bring out those kinds of issues.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things I love about the book is its interdisciplinary character as well. You draw on debates in history, you draw very much on debates in geography, as well as this ethnographic sensibility that I think you bring to the study of Jordan. I might preemptively anticipate a couple of objections from people in different disciplines to do with the scope of protests that you address in the book. For a historian, possibly, I'm going to put it out there, it might seem there might be a question raised about why you're putting protests from very different moments in Jordanian history into the same dialogue. You know, we talk about the revolt in Karak, these anti-Ottoman revolts, tribal revolts against Ottoman conscription and tax collection, are part of the same story you're telling as protests about water shortages in Amman in the early 21st century. So there might be a debate about, are you, whether the question might be, are you talking about evolution of practices over this time, and to what extent are we collapsing some of the differences between these different events? And for anthropologists, perhaps, you might also be collapsing some of the differences between different types of protest. You talk about these different linguistic terms as well that are used, habit hazeran, or the zahaf, or idrab, and so forth. So I understand that you're using the term of protest as a category of analysis rather than a category of practice, etic rather than emic. And you say that you identify protests as involving two elements. It's gatherings in a public assembly and public space, and also that involve claim making. That might also open up the door to look at regime organized events as being protests in that definition. And I wonder whether a strike would also qualify as that. A strike without a picket line would not be a protest in that definition, and we would lose sight perhaps of some of the types of protest and resistance that James Scott famously talks about in Weapons of the Weak by insisting on this public dimension. So you have a very precise analytical sense of what you're looking at in the book. How would you respond to this idea that it might not necessarily correspond to what is happening on the ground and Jordanians' own ideas about what protest is?
Great. Yeah. So most of the historians who've read my book and talked to me about it, or come up to me after talks, love that I'm going back to the Ottoman period, and not just starting with, the post-World War I state making. And one of the reasons I do that is because I'm looking at these long-term repertoires. And so the Ottoman period, the protests were often violent, like they would, kill Ottoman officers and occupy spaces. And so they're not gathering to kill police. But in fact, at the time, if you looked, and I have a number of these in detail, the claims they were making were really similar to claims that they make today, in the sense of like, we're not getting enough of this, or you're taxing us too much, or you're making our women go carry water for the Ottoman officers. Like, that is not cool. We can't do that. So they have these specific sets of claims, and they, hundreds of petitions they'll send to Damascus, et cetera. And so one of the tactics that they use is occupying government property, burning government property down, and blocking roads, right? Because the transit corridor was what was so important for pilgrimage and trade. And so they would block the roads and disrupt transit, tear up part of the train so the train couldn't get through. By going back that far, you see that those tactics are actually still used today. The blocking of roads is very, very common. Burning of government offices and government vehicles outside of the capital and sometimes in the capital, is very, very common. And so it's like these repertoires that they're going back to, that they've long had, that continue. And so I'm looking at what continues, and then what new innovations emerge, other kinds of protests emerge. And I just think you get a richer pattern by going back that far. And also, as you mentioned, sort of giving agency back to Jordanians. It's often seen as, you have the imperial power and then the colonial power, and there's periodic protests, but they get crushed. And I'm showing protests continue quite frequently, and they shape the state in profound ways. The state has to respond to the Bedouin raids by recruiting them into the army. They're tearing up the railroad, so let's hire them to protect the railroad. And that today you still have a strong Bedouin contingent in the services as a result of those, raids that happened in the past. So you see a lot of these ways in which these patterns shape the state that came into being. On the question of how I define protest, it is a very general, broad definition. It's because I'm interested in the spatial question, the public claims making. I'm not saying this is the limit of protests, that other things don't count as protests. So certainly you see quiet protests. I do talk about strikes because strikes often happen in tandem with protests. So in 2018, there was a general strike during the protests in the 50s against the Baghdad Pact. There was a general strike, but they were in tandem with public demonstrations gathering. So I'm trying to sort of attend to those kinds of issues. Government protests, we don't call them protests, because protest is a claim against something. We typically call them rallies. So we distinguish in the contentious politics literature between protests and rallies. And there's all kinds of rallies that have interesting spatial dimensions as well, sort of pro-government issues. In Istanbul, the government wants people to rally in a certain location, but people want to protest in other locations. So you have that kind of interesting dynamic. But I think there's a spatial component to it that's interesting to bring out, in terms of where the government rallies are that then march to the spaces where there's actually protest happening. And then the pro-government will clash with the protesters, often in much more violent ways than when the government clashes with protesters. And so it's those kinds of issues I'm trying to bring to the fore, to bring into view.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that you go back to the late Ottoman period as the beginning of state making, modern state making in Jordan, which I've also written about in the context of the Levant as a whole. And I'm so happy that political scientists have started to engage with this literature in late Ottoman history and this rich historiography that's developed over the last 20 years. It really does reshape or give a different element to how we think about state formation of the region. So I'm entirely persuaded by your arguments. I also wanted to ask, one of the really interesting things that I loved about your book, I'm fascinated by the notion of urban planning and how states use urban planning in order to either repress protests or make protests less likely, but also to restructure and reshape society in lines that help them govern it in particular ways. This is something I wrote about in my own book on Syria under the French mandate in the 20s and 30s. There are very similar processes going on. And it's fascinating to learn how this happens in Jordan, not just under the British, but under after independence too. And you talk about, from the 50s to the 90s, you say there are 56 major planning proposals for Jordan, 4 of which focus on Amman. And what's particularly interesting for me is that these 4 master plans for Amman are either all drafted or heavily influenced by British urban planners. There's a very continuation, even after independence, of the British philosophy, if you like, of urban planning that's implemented in Jordan. And you say that these, I guess 2 questions. Firstly, you talk about how these British influences, these British planners are all trained in European modernist ways of seeing and ordering urban space. And as such, places like Amman reflect this white colonial spatial imaginary. I wanted to firstly ask you about that, because that might be interpreted as suggesting a white colonial spatial imaginary that is monolithic, that is of one basic character. And I know from my studies of the French equivalent that wasn't the case. There were big debates going on amongst French urban planners in situations from Morocco to Syria, in which there were big debates about how to do urban planning. Some of it was very heavily modernist. Some of it was to do with transforming society. Some of it was to do with building these Haussmannian avenues into the old city of Aleppo, for example. In other places, it was about preserving tradition and keeping tradition separate from, enacting this fundamental rupture with more modern places elsewhere. So you had this dialectic of modernization, but also tradition, that was playing out within this colonial spatial imaginary. And I'm kind of interested in that, the way in which modernity and tradition play out in the Jordanian context and thinking about plans. And I'm also interested in the way in which, and there's a lot of literature in history in particular that looks at these urban plans, these master plans, which are always very ambitious, always very radical quite often, but also very rarely get implemented in their entirety. We do devote a lot of time and attention, as the field as a whole, to looking at things that aren't implemented. And again, you can trace that through to King Abdullah's plans for the future of Jordan, and you talk about the Abdali mega project in that kind of context as well. How do you, I'm just kind of interested to hear your thoughts on how this all plays out in Jordan, and the way in which these blueprints are not implemented but derailed. It kind of makes you wonder why we spend so much time, when people spend so much time doing these plans when they don't get implemented. And what does it tell us to look at these future plans that are not implemented?
Great. So yeah, there's 11 questions in there.
Sorry.
No, it's great. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, this is well established, in multiple literatures, but that, central planning projects are seldom constructed in their entirety, and certainly people don't often use them the way in which they are envisioned to be used. So I was interested in the ways in which, particularly the state building project, how the government was envisioning space to be used with the new capital emerging, the desperate need for housing, particularly with the Palestinian and other refugees coming in, and then what gets built and what doesn't get built, I think is very interesting and very telling. And so I look at these over the period to see one of the things that emerges. Well, first is typically, and why I think it's a colonial spatial imaginary, and it's not. I certainly don't mean it to be monolithic. Obviously, like all plans, you have a vision, but what it looks like in practice takes many forms. And different aspects of that vision as well, is partly to construct a state, the new state of Jordan in the 30s and 40s, that's going to have the requisite counterpart institutions to engage with the colonizing state, with the British state. So that's to say, you need the certain types of ministries to be constructed so they have a counterpart ministry. You need a certain kind of economy to construct it so it has a counterpart with outside. And so they're trying to bring that into being, even though there's a lot of resistance to this. Oh, and I see we're running out of time. Let me just say real quickly.
Go ahead, Jillian, answer the question.
Okay, yeah. So I mentioned already Eliana Abu Hamdi, who has a manuscript that I've been fortunate enough to read. It's not published yet, but you should look out for it. And it's called Unplanning the City, Unplanning Amman. And it's about the ways in which Jordanians in various sorts mobilize against these urban planning documents because they don't like what is happening. They don't want their land to be rezoned because they want the land to be used in any kind of way they want. And it's this fascinating 100-year history of efforts to upend and disrupt these plans. They don't take the form of protest the way I'm talking about it, but they end up sort of pushing back against these plans. And then one last interesting, I didn't answer all your questions, but one last interesting thing that comes into view by going back to these early planning documents is exactly as you said, this idea of like, we need to have a heritage zone, this sort of, we need to construct a romantic past. And Amman, as people know, and I show in the book, but it's been well written about, was not even, it was only seasonally inhabited in the late 19th century and only becomes a major city when Abdullah settles there and it becomes the capital. And so it doesn't have old architecture. It has, some Roman ruins because it was the ancient city of Philadelphia was on that location, and everything else is, 100, 150 years old. So through this century, instead of preserving what was the early Amman architecture of the 20s and 30s, which had a very particular style, they want to have a more romantic past, like to construct a more romantic, old Medina kind of downtown where people can go have that romantic Oriental experience, to juxtapose to the gleaming modern, the projects I showed you, these skyscrapers, which, sit half built, by the way. A lot of them have, they're the Abdali project in particular, a lot of those towers are actually empty. They're finished outside, but they're not occupied. So it's quite hollow. But in advancing this old romantic past that you have to partly reconstruct and the gleaming modern, they're actually eliminating the actual modern period, that is the modern period of the 20th century, and the architect that was, unique to it. And so you have all the architects and urban planners in Amman like struggling to preserve these old buildings, but they're seen as not old enough and then not shiny and new enough. And so that is a part of the struggle for the city to create this new Amman. And one of the perverse things that happens is the West Amman, where you have these gleaming projects and all the nightclubs and bars and rooftop bars that overlook on East Amman. The development project they have for East Amman is to paint the facades, the front of buildings that you can see from West Amman so that they look nicer, but not actually to reconstruct these crumbling houses. So it's completely perverse that it's just a vista. Its value is just as something to look on. It's sort of, the old part of the city, how pretty. The beautiful Ashrafia Mosque, how pretty, but not actually invest as much as you're investing in the West.
I want to keep hearing the two of you talk, but unsurprisingly, we have a rich body of questions. And so I want to build up on some of the issues that Daniel raised in the conversation between you two about kind of definitions. And so you have a question about failed protest and about routine protest. And basically they're asking you to define what each is, but I want to put it maybe in a larger context. Of course, for anybody who studies Iran, this notion of, success versus failure keeps popping up. And we tend to think of protests. It's if there's a failed revolution, it's just a bunch of protests. So that's why the question of failed protests and routine protests becomes, I think, really interesting. And we're curious what the Jordan example gives us in terms of insights, both for Jordan and for the larger Middle East.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, the literature on protest, a lot of it is concerned with success failure. So you have, debates like, our nonviolent protests more successful than violent protests? Do they accomplish their goals? And I'm not opposed to that kind of question. In fact, I show, as I mentioned here as well, that a lot of these small protests are actually effective in accomplishing their goals. They're getting more from the government than they were if they were moving through other channels, right? So there are a lot of ways in which they're successful. So success or fail is typically, does it accomplish what it sets out to do? You're making claims, are those claims realized? That's fine, I said, I talk about that, but I think it's a narrow view of thinking like, what are the political effects of protests? And with the Kaludi routine protests, I tried to show, and I do other ones, but since those are the ones I talked about today, that they do other kinds of political work, even if they're not succeeding in canceling the peace treaty. For the Muslim Brotherhood, they allow them to sort of show to their constituents that they're still relative and still contentious. For some of the other leftist activists, they allows them to keep the public debate open, to keep signaling to the regime that everyone's not okay with this. So they do other kinds of political work that I think is important beyond the success failure model. And often those effects ripple. So, Occupy Wall Street arguably failed, but Occupy Sandy emerged out of Occupy Wall Street. A lot of the people in Occupy Wall Street have gone on to be activists in other kind of avenues, even though Occupy failed, right? So I want to, not say the success failure question isn't important. It is important, but I think it can narrow our vision to miss the political effects of protests in other kinds of ways. For routine protests, someone asked me this the other day as well. It's like, what is the difference between an innovative protest and when does it become routine? And there's not obviously a standard a single line at which it becomes routine. But for me, the ones I call routine are ones that replicate a common spatial and temporal pattern over and over, that the passerbys, anyone's familiar with it, knows what that pattern is going to be. The police are familiar with what that pattern is going to be. And so typically, if you don't cross red lines, you can go the protest as long as you adhere to what we're used to. So you gather here, you go in the street, you chant, you march to the line, you chant, you call the police betraying Jordan and betraying Palestine, and then you sing Maltani at the end of the protest, and then you go home and go to coffee shops. And so they become routine when the patterns are very familiar. The spatial and temporal patterns are known and familiar. That doesn't mean everyone adheres to them. Like the one I chose to show you, where they brought in the plainclothes thug Beltagia kind of guys. That was the first time they'd done that on that particular protest. The protesters were like, what is this? We haven't seen this before. So they were like nervous. What does this mean? Are these guys going to come beat us up? And then that became routine, like you're familiar with it. So the routine is simply when it's replicated enough time that essentially both sides are familiar with how it's going to play out.
I mean, that's a good way to seg into. You've had a couple of questions about the effect of protests on changing the regime, for lack of a better word, or the monarchy. And so I'm going to combine a couple of these questions. So the first part of it would be a question from our colleague at the Crown Center, which is why the Jordanian regime then tolerates these frequent protests when other governments in the Middle East or elsewhere in general, may be tolerating these things less frequently. And the question is it partly because the monarchy feels that will ultimately be protected against revolt by the US, Israel, and perhaps Saudi? And then that leads to another question of, so basically, what the monarchy and the change in the monarchy, what ultimately is going to be, how do you understand, in other words, a regime change in a monarchy in a place like Jordan?
Okay, so the first part of the question is related to the second part of the question. So that's great that you put them together. I think that Jordan is a case of the regime can't use violence against a certain constituency. And it's a constituency which is seen as important to its support base. And that's the sort of East Bank areas. I emphasize in the book, East Bank is not a monolith. There's differences. East Bank is the source of the sort of longstanding communist leftists as well as loyalists. So East Bank isn't a monolith. But this is a sort of, longstanding support base. And people in Jordan from those communities talk about the sort of social contract, ijtimai, that took place in the 30s and 40s, which was, we'll support you, but you do stuff for us. You give us jobs, you take care of us, you provide infrastructure. And so in a certain sense, those areas are where you're getting most of the protests, most critical of the regime. They're like, you're not taking care of us. How come, in Anne-Marie Belluni's wonderful book, how come the Syrian refugees have water in their camps and we don't have enough water? Why aren't you getting us water? What about these jobs? And so a lot of those protests aren't protests against the regime. They're not protests calling for the fall of the regime. They're protests to say, you're supposed to do stuff for us. They're also the group, for the most part, with exceptions I show, that want the monarchy to remain, maybe in a different form, maybe a different king, but we want the old state back. We don't want this neoliberal downsized state. We want the welfare state back. We want the stuff you're supposed to do for us. So the protests are making those kinds of specific demands, and they don't get everything, but they get a lot of those. It's not the sort of the political parties that are calling for, democracy per se. These groups aren't calling for democracy. They're calling for, you're supposed to do stuff for us. Some of them are. I mean, it's not a monolith. But so I think that's part of the reason that the government can't use violence against them, is because this is its supposed support base. And that support base, East Bank Jordanians, are less than 50% of the population, or less than 50% of the citizens. And then add to that the Iraqis, not less than 1 million, but a chunk of Iraqis who aren't going home, Syrians who probably aren't going home. And the majority of Syrian refugees, only roughly 10% are actually in the camps. Most of them have been absorbed into Irbil and Amman, into the urban fabric, and they're not going home. So this East Bank has a smaller and smaller slice of the actual population, and yet they're supporting the monarchy the most. Even though they're making demands on the monarchy, they're more in favor of maintaining the monarchy. So if you were to take this outside of Jordan, you would say, is there a particular constituency engaged in protest and claims making that's harder for the regime to use violence against? That would be the kind of corollary. And I think in Jordan, there's a slice of the population, it's harder for them to use violence against. They arrest people, but if you're from a prominent tribe, then they'll come and protest, and eventually you'll have to sort of let the person go, or they're not going to go home. If you're from a small unknown tribe, or as I show one activist, a nuclear activist, who describes himself from a shit Christian tribe, he's like, nobody cares. They have no influence in government. They're not going to be able to come and rescue me. And so I think that's the kind of dynamic that you see. As for, I don't know when you see regime change. I do show in a chapter on the uprising period that something changed, the sort of willingness of people to directly criticize the king openly in public from the uprising period, particularly in 2002 and up until today. And the regime is really cracking down harder than it ever has on protest, arresting activists. The Teachers Association is disbanded, and using the coronavirus to arrest people. A social media post can get you brought up on terrorist charge under the cybercrimes law. Cartoonist Ahmed Hijaj, who's Jordanian's sort of national treasure, cartoonist, on his own social media posted one critical of the Abraham Accords, and he got arrested and charged with terrorism for posting that image. And so the government is just really trying now to crack down on protests and activism more and more. And yet you still have the same pattern that if you're from certain areas, you're going to get released. You're not going to be charged in the same kind of way. And so I think, you're seeing that. So I think the issue I mentioned briefly that about is the monarchy going to fall or not? I don't know, if it falls in 10 years, you can find evidence for or against it in my book, because they show there's tremendous, more criticism of the king than there ever has been. They do these debkas, the corruption debka, where they mock the king or they mock the queen directly by name. So I have in the book the Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves, and the second line is Ali Baba Athani and the 40 Thieves, and the third line is Abdullah Athani and the 40 Thieves. So it's like you're calling out directly the monarch in ways that weren't happening before. So I think the monarch's panicky about this. It's trying to silence dissent, but it's not going to be entirely effective. But again, a lot of the ones critical of him are critical not because they want an end to the monarchy and a democracy, because for East Bank communities, if you have a real democracy, you have a Palestinian majority in the country. That's not what they want. They want the slice of their pie protected. And so that's where we're at. You see in the uprising period, people calling for constitutional monarchy, of course, people calling for a republic with no monarchy at all, people calling for the monarchy can remain, but you're supposed to do reforms. We want the welfare state back. The monarchy can remain, but we want maybe a different monarch. Maybe his brother might be a better monarch. And then the last one is the monarch, the king can remain, but this is the last king. Like, we're done after this. He can live out his term, but we're not, there's no monarch after this. So you saw this range of criticism emerged in, and this is all taken from protests, what people say at protests. So there's other avenues you can look at this stuff, and there's a ton of stuff online you can look at, but I'm really looking at what comes out when people are in public making these kinds of claims.
I want to pick up the thread of violence that came out both in your conversation with Dan and just right now in your answer. So I'm going to give privilege to one of my undergraduate students who's asked you a question about this. She writes, from the Druze revolt, where the people prepared for the Ottoman troops to attack, to more modern protests in Amman, where it seems that no one expects violence to occur, as you just mentioned. There's a difference between protests then and protests now. And she's asking you for that point of change for this shift in the dynamic. So you talked about violence being a threshold, but the question is, how did that violence become the threshold that you're talking about in the period that we're talking about today? And I want to link that to another question you got, which was, again, you mentioned right now in your response about online social media, but the question kind of shifts it to the government's use of internet censorship, VPN blocking, as a form of dealing with these protests, and sort of use that to anchor the now. What is different about now, not just in terms of violence, but also in terms of the tactics and methods of the monarchy in dealing with protests?
Okay, so the big shift in violence comes in the 20s and 30s. So first, you see the emergence of what we recognize as demonstrations, protests where people gather in public peacefully to make claims and carry placards and shout slogans. That really emerges in the 20s and 30s and continues up until today. But the violence that took place before, as I said, certain parts of it exist up until today again. So, burning government property, destroying government property, blocking roads, destroying infrastructure, all of that continues up until today. What's missing is the, killing Ottoman officials has not translated into killing government officials, killing police. So that changes. So it's less of a moment of rupture as a layering of new modes and new modalities of protest emerge while the old violence shifts slightly. The last massacre there was in Jordan was done by the British, was the Adwan Revolution, Adwan Rebellion, not revolution, where the Royal Air Force killed dozens of people. Doesn't mean people don't die in protests, they do, but not in large numbers and not massacres, and the government is not shooting live ammo into the crowds. And so the violence that emerges often takes the form either of destruction of property by protesters, particularly outside of Amman, or the use of billy clubs and dogs and horses and other kinds of things to violently disperse protesters. A lot of people have cracked skulls. Deaths tend to be from those kinds of wielding, sort of, whether it's curfews where they go in and go house to house or breaking up crowds. The book cover itself is in chapter 7 in its entirety, because the book it's truncated, but it shows this picture of, so this is a gendarmerie with a little boy hugging him and there's hearts. And this is about the protest in May of 2018 at the Fourth Circle. The gendarmerie was really well behaved and all the media were there, and the crown prince actually went to there and thanked the gendarmerie for protecting Jordanians' rights to express themselves, blah, blah, blah. While in Hayt Tafela, a neighborhood not far away, they're beating protesters for the same thing because it was seen as too much. No, first place, there weren't media there, but also they were seen as too contentious for the regime. So the massive gathering was peaceful, but didn't mean they weren't using violence at other locations. And that's, as Dan mentioned, one of the arguments of the book is we need to attend the police responses, government responses of repression vary not just on who's protesting and how they're protesting and what they're saying, but also where they're protesting. That's an important factor. So to try to bring that in. So I do think that this thinking about violence, again, not as a rupture so much as a sort of an evolution, helps bring that into view. On the use of the internet, it's a very short passage in the book to talk about the internet because for two reasons. One, there's a massive body of theoretical work on thinking about internet and eversion and all these ways of understanding different spatial, the virtual space versus material space. Binary has basically been abandoned in the literature. And as I got into that literature, I was just way out of my depth in the understanding of the status of those debates. So I really only talk about it in terms of the things people post there and the fact that the government is now policing the social media very aggressively. And this is happening everywhere. I know in Egypt, they have a whole agency that does nothing but monitor social media. So this is the kind of cat and mouse thing that's happening everywhere, which is activists try to find these spaces and try to have spaces where they can meet and organize, and yet the government's trying to infiltrate those spaces. So that's really would be a fantastic project. There's some of the tribal groups will post criticisms of the king, like manifestos, and I talk about some of these that will say, the king is corrupt and he has to go, and it comes from the sons of the Bani somebody. And then an account, and then somebody else will post, and they're like, "You're not speaking for us. We are actually the sons of the Bani Fulenda," this kind of thing. And so you have these sort of dueling claims of speaking, and that would be, if someone's looking for a dissertation project, it's very doable. It would be fascinating, but I really only treat it briefly because I realized that was going to be way out of my depth, and the book does so much already. But it's not something I'm uninterested in. It's a fantastic area for inquiry.
Great. So I want to sort of shift a little bit to a question from one of our junior research fellows who's asking you about protester tactics, basically. Tactics that protesters use. In particular here, not tactics necessarily to protest, but what he's calling tactics that they use to disorient the state's efforts to make these routine protests, in other words. And so the first question is that, what are some of the tactics they use? How do people inscribe and reorganize these spaces that you've talked about that's been assigned by the state for protests? Do they give it new meanings? Do they give it new functions? So if you put up a barricade, basically, can the protesters come and do something different with them? And can you also talk a little bit more on how these protests create new and longitudinal affects like memory, meaning, collectively shared sensibilities, new subjectivities that are beyond material outcomes? And I think in this case, Emra's question reminds me a lot about Youssef Eshezli's work on Egypt, about thinking about the success of these protests as going beyond these material outcomes and more on the way in which generations are being shaped and changed by the memory of these protests.
Great. So great question. So on the first one, if I understand, it is about activists, like, do protesters have an ability to shape space the same way the state does? You're always at a disadvantage to the state, right? So often it's sort of temporary, it's ephemeral. The state doesn't want evidence, as I talked about these erasures, they don't want evidence that there have been successful protests. And so they'll try to, again, erase any evidence of it, divert protests to other locations. The fourth circle where the prime ministry is now, you can't protest there anymore. You can protest down in that parking lot that has a wall around it. So nobody protests there anymore either. So you're always at a disadvantage vis-a-vis the state, which is one of the reasons why the Kaludi mosques, that are routine ones I talked about, is simply by continuing to protest in a space, they can continue to signify it as a space for protest, even if they're not allowed, not able to create any permanent markings or permanent either markings or structures that facilitate protests, because the state can take it away. During the Sheikh Jarrah protest, someone went around. This is from Kyle Craig, the anthropologist who's doing fascinating work on public graffiti in Amman. He found that people had painted the Israeli flag on trash cans all over the place as it was trash, and someone in the municipality decided they didn't want them there, so went around and had them all painted over it and erased, so that wasn't an embarrassment that the Israeli flag was being desecrated in that kind of way. So it's really like a cat and mouse game with the graffiti. It's up there one day, it's gone. You signify a space, it's gone. But simply continuing to have protest in spaces makes it in public memory a place for protest, and that's one of the reasons that they tried to do that. So I think it's a great question. The second one was, what was the second question?
It was, well, could you talk about these non-material outcomes that are longer term?
Right.
Affective?
Right. Yeah, I mean, so I talked about some of them already with the, sort of placemaking, and I think the question had more to do with, identities and these kinds of affinities that emerge in and around protests. And so a lot of that is really important. And so I show, for example, that a lot of the new protester groups that emerged in 2011, which are broadly called Hirak under a broad umbrella, but they have all different names. Those who could get to Amman relatively quickly, like in an hour, hour and a half, created new networks amongst themselves because they started to see each other in protest, and it sort of built different kinds of alliances and allegiances, as well as, practical actual networks through the protests themselves that don't extend down to Karak, down to places in the south where those people aren't making their way to Amman for protests. So in a way, you're seeing these protests creating encounters that create new affinities, new collaborations that have very real, like long-term ripple effects. There is a fascinating story about some of those early protests, and particularly the Adwan rebellion, which is put down violently, but then the Adwanis, and this is one of the examples I show, but the Adwanis end up being very close to the Emir, partly because the massacre was above and beyond what was acceptable morally. And so they end up getting brought in and given government jobs. And today the Adwanis are very close to the regime, but it's a very massive tribal confederation. So Andrew Shryak, the anthropologist, shows in his work the ways in which the prominent families in the Adwan diminish that protest. They don't want to talk about it. They sort of, but we were always close kind of thing. Whereas I found for Adwanis farther from that center, ones that aren't, in the center prominent family, but are nonetheless part of that tribe, they remember it as like, yeah, we're badass. We were the ones that stood up way before. And in Karak, they talk about, when Karakis show up, they know we mean business. So they have this memory of resistance and rebellion that goes way back. And so I find those fascinating, the sort of the role that large-scale protests play in memory and not. And just the last piece of it, during the 2018 protests, a lot of people were saying, like, there's never been a general strike before, and Jordanians have never turned out in such massive numbers, none of which are true. So it was interesting for a new generation discovering that this is a thing, this could be, when in fact, in 2012, there were massive protests that called for the downfall of the king. So it's that I find really fascinating and interesting, like what role these events play in people's memory of connected to their identity, who we are as people, and again, reproduce these localized spatial imaginaries, like in Karak, we're badass, right. And that area is still a real entity to them.
We're so quickly running out of time and we have so many questions, but I actually wanted to use our last minutes to kind of ask Daniel a question and then give you a chance, Jillian, for any final thoughts. And just so everybody knows, we had a lot of questions. Jillian and Dan will get your questions as a transcript, and please feel free to get in touch with them. But I wanted, I was thinking of your work, Daniel, and listening to Jillian and reading her book, because in some ways, Syria has become like the boogeyman and also the mentor of authoritarianism. So if you don't allow routine protests, if you don't allow all these things that she beautifully lays out in the book, then you manage to hold on to your power, is, I think, a lesson that certain states, the Iranians in particular, for example, in this case, have taken. And yet Jillian is presenting a different model of a relationship between a non-democratic state and protests. And I was just curious, as someone who's an expert on Syria, but also is an expert on the wider region, Dan, what are your thoughts about that, about why these lessons are taken from the Syrian case, but not, for example, taken from the Jordanian case as a successful case of how to deal with a population pushback? And then once you give your thoughts, Jillian, any other final thoughts you have, and we'll unfortunately then end this wonderful session.
That's a remarkably difficult question to answer in the remaining 30 seconds. I think one thing that actually struck me in relation to the Syrian case, building on where Jillian's line of argumentation is not just about failed protests, but also about failed reforms. And in Syria, for example, we often forget or overlook the Damascus Spring of 2000, 2001, when what we had was not a protest movement, but political activity, which did not have the kind of long-term transformative impact that often it was hoped or expected it would. And it's often dismissed because of that. So I think Jillian is actually Jillian's work suggests a broader argument that says perhaps we should go back and look at these episodes that started to unfold, even though they did not reach maturity. And conversely, I think if you look at actually what happened in Syria, you can make the argument that had the regime allowed more decompression in the early 2000s, it would not have culminated in the outbreak of violent uprisings in 2011. There's actually an argument that the Syrian intellectual Barhan al-Ghalioun made back in 2003, soon after the Damascus Spring salons had been closed down. He said that if the regime closes down the intellectuals, if it closes down the people who are going to be the core of party politics, all that's left will be a conflict between the mukhabarat, the intelligence, the coercive arms of the state, and unmediated social formations, primordial sentiments. So in a way, I think I could actually draw the opposite argument from the Syrian case, and that supports the argument that the Jordanian example, for all its faults, allows a certain decompression to take place.
Wow. Jillian, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, the book very much to sort of spark these kinds of questions about comparison, and one goal is to upend this is what happens in democracies and this is what happens in authoritarian cases, and think more like, where are protests tolerated? Where are they not tolerated? And that's a question immediately relevant to the United States as well, how police respond to certain protests. And so I want people to think about this. I'm hoping people will think about this in these terms. And I was talking to someone last week about the protests in Iran right now, and they said Iran has a really rich history of protests. There's like a lot of small protests all the time that nobody talks about. And I was completely unaware of that. And so I'm hoping people can start paying attention to thinking comparatively, pushing back against my work and building on it as well, but thinking about where are protests tolerated? What kinds of protests are tolerated? Are there routines that are tolerated? Because one of the things I show is certain routines are tolerated and other routines are not tolerated at all. Dan mentioned tents, especially since the uprising. Tent means encampment, means long-term protest. The government does not want anything long-term. So they go to crazy lengths to pull down anything they think is a tent. And I have one instance, they're trying to unfold a banner, and the government won't, or the police won't let them unfold the banner until they're convinced that it's not actually a tent, because they don't want tents. And so just thinking, what's tolerated, what's not tolerated, what spaces are tolerated, what are their small protests. Robert Parks shows in Algeria in a piece in Marip that in Algeria, there's 10 to 12,000 protests every year. And yet we don't think of Algeria as being up in revolutionary flame, although we did have the 2019 massive uprising about whether the president was going to have another term. But rather, these are small local protests, sometimes 50 people or a dozen people, who make claims directly to the government and often get their grievances addressed. So we're just not paying attention to these little things. I know the big protests are exciting because they can bring, systemic change or not, and they're dramatic, and I'm not diminishing their importance, but I think attending to these other kinds of protests can just give us a richer understanding as well. So I really, I'm hoping people take up this as an invitation to help think with me. I'm developing right now an article that looks beyond Jordan. And right now I'm looking at, to take some of the arguments beyond Jordan, and particularly around space in the built environment. And I'm looking at also Cairo, Istanbul, Mexico City, and Guatemala City right now. And so I'm interested, and I'm glad you invited people to be in touch, and please do, if you're interested, and email me. And I love to hear what this makes people think of. It's one of my favorite kinds of interventions. Is not a question necessarily, but this reminded me of something. Yeah. And so I think those are great conversations. And I will look forward to reading. I'm not reading the Q&A right now so I can focus, because if I'm distracted, I can't multitask. My brain will fail. But I'm going to look forward to reading through all the questions, and I'm grateful for them. And thank you. lots of questions makes me feel that it was engaging, and that makes me super happy.
It absolutely was. And I think basically the takeaway is we need to think about a conference on these topics and take it from there. And on that note, thank you all for attending this talk, and especially thank you to Dr. Neep for being in conversation with Dr. Schwedler. And thank you, Dr. Schwedler, for writing this fantastic book. And thank you for accepting our invitation and being non-resident scholars at the Crown Center, both of you. Until next time, which is March 15th, thank you all and join us again. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.